A cold wind cut through the cemetery as a wealthy widow in a gray cashmere coat placed roses on her son's grave, then froze. A young black mother knelt there, silently crying, a toddler clutching a daisy with the same tilt of the head her son had. The widow's jaw tightened. "Why are you here?" The mother stood, protective. The child stared at the photo on the stone and smiled like him. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening and the world needs to hear them. Keisha Johnson wiped her eyes and lifted her chin. "We came to say hello." Grace Whitmore's voice turned sharp. "This is Ryan's grave. You don't belong here." Keisha glanced at the marble, then at the little girl. "He belonged to more than you think." The toddler squeezed Keisha's hand. "Mommy, is that the nice man?" Grace stared at the child. The same soft smile, the same bright eyes Ryan had as a boy. Her stomach dropped. What's her name?" "Emma," Keisha said. "She just turned 2. Silence stretched. A flag on a distant headstone snapped in the wind. Grace folded her arms, clinging to control. "You knew my son, how?" Keisha's answer was steady. "He was kind to me when no one else was. We met before the accident." Grace's eyebrows arched. "Impossible. I knew everyone in Ryan's life." Keisha's mouth tightened. "You knew everyone you allowed near him." Grace flinched, then masked it with ice. "If you're here to ask for money, don't." "I'm not," Keisha said. "I work double shifts. We're fine." Emma pointed at the etched portrait. "He looks happy." Keisha swallowed. "He was." Grace's gaze returned to the child. The math wouldn't stop screaming in her head. 2 years old, Ryan gone for 2.5. Her voice thinned. "How old exactly?" 27 months. Another silence, this one heavier. Grace stepped closer, searching Emma's face for a lie, and finding only innocence. "Did Ryan know?" "I tried," Keisha said. "I called. I showed up. I was turned away." "By whom?" Keisha met her eyes. "People who said they answered to you." A gust rattled the trees. Grace's composure cracked to the edges. "If this is true, why now?" Keisha glanced at the flowers. "Because Emma deserves to know where kindness is buried and who buried it." She took a breath. "We won't stay. I wouldn't want to make you uncomfortable." Keisha turned to go. Emma looked back at the stone, small hand lifted in a clumsy wave. Grace's control snapped. "Wait!" The word came out more plea than command. Keisha paused, half-turned, steady. Grace's voice softened against her will. "If you're telling the truth, then I need to know everything." Keisha nodded once. "On my terms." She picked up Emma, and the three of them stood in a hush, grief, guilt, and a truth that refused to stay buried, while the camera of the day finally began to roll. Grace didn't sleep that night. The image of Emma's tiny hand waving at Ryan's gravestone replayed like a loop she couldn't shut off. In her mind, it kept pairing with another memory. Ryan, age 19, begging her at the dinner table. "Mom, can we please stop pretending your rules are the only way to live?" She had shut the conversation down, like she always did. The next morning, she drove through the quiet streets toward the hospital where Keisha worked. She wasn't sure why. Curiosity, fear, guilt, or the need to prove the girl wrong. Maybe all of them. When she spotted Keisha outside the employee entrance, balancing a backpack and a lunch bag, Emma tugging at her coat, something in Grace's chest tightened unexpectedly. Keisha noticed her, but didn't smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, you followed us." "I came to talk," Grace said, voice clipped. "Yesterday was confusing." Keisha adjusted Emma on her hip. "Confusing for who?" Grace ignored the sting. "You claim my son cared for you." "He did," Keisha replied. "But you made sure that didn't last." Grace stiffened. "I didn't even know you." "You didn't want to know me." Keisha's tone wasn't loud, but it was unshakably firm. Emma reached for a juice box in Keisha's bag. Grace watched the child's gestures. Ryan used to do the same thing before kindergarten, when he still felt safe enough to ask for help. Her throat tightened. "What exactly happened between you and Ryan?" Grace asked. Keisha took a breath, as if choosing which truth to reveal. "We met at the clinic. He came in for volunteer work. He was sweet, funny, awkward sometimes. Not the picture-perfect man you push him to be. Grace lifted her chin. Ryan wasn't pushed. He was directed. Keisha gave a small, sad laugh. That's the problem. He needed a mother. You gave him a manager. The words hit harder than Grace expected. Keisha continued, quieter now. We spent 2 years together. He wanted to tell you, but he was scared. Said you judged me by where I lived, not who I was. Grace felt her jaw clench. Ryan never hid things from me. You're wrong, Keisha said. He hid the parts of himself he knew you'd reject. Emma tugged at Keisha's sleeve. Mommy, home? In a minute, baby. Grace exhaled. And the pregnancy? I tried 3 times to tell him, Keisha said. But your people blocked me at the company gate. They said I wasn't appropriate. Their words, not mine. Grace's stomach churned. She had heard those exact phrases used by staff before, and she'd never questioned them. Keisha stepped back, protective of Emma. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't want your approval. I just want my daughter to know her father was a mistake. Grace swallowed. And what do you want from me? Keisha met her gaze, steady and unwavering. Right now, for you to understand that your son loved someone you didn't think was worthy. That line hung between them. Quiet, precise, impossible to run from. Grace glanced at Emma again. The little girl's eyes caught sunlight, turning them the exact shade Ryan's eyes had when he laughed. Her heart cracked just a little. Keisha shifted her bag. We have to go. I'm late. They passed each other in the cold morning air. One carrying years of privilege, the other carrying a child and the weight of a truth that refused to stay small. And for the first time, Grace felt the ground beneath her certainty begin to move. Grace spent the next 2 days digging through memories she spent years avoiding. She searched old emails, schedules, company logs, anything that could prove Keisha wrong. But every document she opened pushed her further into a truth she didn't want to face. Her assistant, Megan, knocked on the office door. You asked me to pull security records from 2 years ago. Yes, Grace said, trying to keep her voice even. Show me every visitor Ryan tried to see. Megan hesitated. There's a pattern. Grace frowned. What pattern? Megan placed a tablet on the desk. A young black woman came to see Mr. Whitmore 3 times. Each time she was marked as a security risk and escorted out. Grace's pulse thumped. Who ordered that classification? Megan swallowed. You did, ma'am. Or at least your office did. Grace stared at the screen. Her own signature authorized a restriction. She remembered none of it. Or rather, she remembered giving a vague instruction years ago. Keep certain people away, for his reputation. And her staff, trained to anticipate her biases, had done the rest. Later that afternoon, Grace drove to the hospital again. This time, Keisha saw her approach and didn't hide her disappointment. You digging already? I just want the truth, Grace said. About my son. About you. Keisha nodded once. Then listen. She stepped aside, letting Grace stand under the shade of the loading ramp. Emma napped in her stroller, tiny legs relaxed, curls framing her cheeks. Ryan and I weren't a mistake, Keisha began. He wasn't slumming. He wasn't confused. He loved me. Grace swallowed. And you never told him about Emma? I tried. Keisha's voice cracked, but she steadied it. 7 months pregnant, working nights, exhausted. I still tried. Grace looked away. The truth was sharper than she expected. Keisha crossed her arms. You know what your guard said the last time I came? You're not the kind of woman a Whitmore brings home. He said that while I was standing there holding a sonogram picture. Grace's chest tightened. Shame had weight, and hers felt heavy. Keisha stepped closer, lowering her voice. You think you know pain? Try walking home in the rain after being told your child isn't good enough to exist in his own father's world. Grace exhaled shakily. I didn't know. You didn't ask, Keisha replied. Emma stirred, blinking awake. When she lifted her head, she made a sleepy expression Ryan used to make at 3 years old. Grace remembered it instantly. Keisha leaned down to fix Emma's blanket. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to protect my daughter from people who think their money decides her worth. The accusation wasn't loud, but it echoed. Grace stepped back, breath unsteady. What are you planning to do? Keisha gave a tired, knowing half-smile. Mrs. Whitmore, I've been planning something for 2 years, and you're just now noticing. Those words chilled Grace more than the winter air. For the first time, she realized the girl she dismissed wasn't powerless. She was prepared. Grace sat in her car long after Keisha walked away, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. Everything she once felt certain about, Ryan's life, his relationships, her control, was slipping through her fingers like sand she couldn't gather back. She had always dictated outcomes. She had always chosen who entered her world. But she was beginning to understand. Keisha hadn't shown up empty-handed. She had shown up ready. The following morning, Grace requested a meeting with one of her company's senior managers. I need access to archive visitor logs, internal investigations, everything tied to Ryan from the last 3 years, she said curtly. The manager hesitated. Ma'am, are you sure? Do it. He nodded and hurried out. 30 minutes later, Grace stared at a stack of printed logs. Her breath caught when she saw one line highlighted. Access denied. Reason. Per executive instruction. Her instruction. Her doing. Her barrier. Ryan had always said, Mom, you make decisions as if they're laws. And she had. She just hadn't realized how many lives those decisions shattered. That afternoon, she found herself driving, again, to the same playground near the hospital. Keisha was pushing him on a swing, her face exhausted but calm. The child giggled, tiny boots kicking the air. Ryan used to laugh the same way when he was small, throwing his legs out like he was trying to fly. Grace approached slowly. I want to talk. Keisha didn't turn fully. Talking hasn't helped you so far. Please, Grace said quietly. I need to understand everything. Keisha stopped the swing gently and faced her. Understanding comes with honesty. Are you ready for that? Grace nodded, though she wasn't sure she truly was. Keisha exhaled. You really want the truth? Fine. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick, worn folder. Not random papers. Organized, dated, structured, like someone had been assembling it piece by piece. For a long time, I started documenting everything the day your guards pushed me off company property, Keisha said. Names, dates, times. The remarks they made. The emails your assistant sent denying my requests. The voices. The warnings. Even the way they looked at me, like I was dirt on white floors. Grace swallowed hard. Why document it? Keisha's eyes hardened. Because I learned early that when you're a black woman, people don't believe your pain unless you have proof. So I built proof. She placed the folder into Grace's hands. It was heavy, not just in weight, but in consequence. Inside was a timeline. Her attempt to contact Ryan, phone logs, screenshots, security notes, a statement from a receptionist, even a written account from a night shift janitor who saw her crying outside the lobby doors. Grace's fingers trembled. You've been keeping this for years? Yes, Keisha replied. Not to punish you, to protect Emma, to make sure no one could erase her existence the way you tried to erase me. Grace's eyes stung, but she blinked hard. What are you planning to do with it? Keisha looked down at her daughter. Whatever I must, if Emma is ever threatened again. The wind rustled the leaves overhead. The air felt thicker, heavier. You think you're the only one who loved Ryan? Keisha asked quietly. Grace didn't answer. Keisha stepped closer, voice lower but steady. I loved him enough to stand outside in the rain for an hour, hoping he'd come down. Loved him enough to keep his messages. Loved him enough to save hair from his jacket for a DNA test, just in case someday, someone like you, tried to deny Emma's blood. Grace's breath hitched. DNA test. Keisha nodded. Done months ago. Results sealed. Stored safely. Power shifted in that moment. Cleanly, undeniably. Grace, who spent a lifetime controlling outcomes with money and influence, suddenly realized she was standing before someone who didn't need wealth, didn't need status, and didn't need permission. Keisha had truth. Keisha had proof. Keisha had motherhood as her weapon and her shield. Emma tugged at her mother's coat. "Mommy, swing." "In a minute, baby." Grace forced herself to speak. "What do you want from me?" Keisha studied her carefully, as if measuring sincerity. "I want respect. For me, for Emma, for the life your son should have been allowed to choose." Grace bowed her head, not out of obligation, but out of something new for her, humility. Keisha turned back to Emma. "Come on, sweetheart. One more push." She walked away, confident, unafraid, leaving Grace with the folder, a quiet, devastating reminder that the girl she underestimated had built a fortress while Grace wasn't looking. As Emma squealed with laughter and the swing rose into the gray afternoon sky, Grace felt it fully for the first time. She was no longer in control. And Keisha had always known this day was coming. Grace arrived at the park early the next morning, heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit. She had spent the entire night reading every page in Keisha's folder, every timestamp, every recorded attempt, every note from security. She saw her own signature stamped across decisions that had broken her son's life in ways she never imagined. This meeting wasn't hers to control, but she still tried to pretend it was. Keisha arrived 15 minutes later, holding Emma's hand. The little girl ran straight to the slide, her laughter filling the quiet morning air. She had Ryan's joy, untouched, unfiltered, untouched by the weight her mother carried. Grace took a step forward. "Thank you for coming." Keisha didn't bother with politeness. "You asked, I agreed. That's all." Grace inhaled. "I want to make things right." Keisha's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Do you even know what right looks like?" Grace opened her bag, pulling out neatly organized documents, financial support plans, trust fund outlines, proposed apology statement drafted by her PR team. Keisha didn't even look at them. "No," she said. "Absolutely not." Grace stiffened. "You haven't even heard, and I don't need to." Keisha cut in. "You're still trying to solve everything with money and control. Nothing has changed." Before Grace could answer, a man approached them, a tall black man in a navy coat, carrying a briefcase. "Sorry I'm late," he said to Keisha. "Traffic." Keisha nodded. "David, this is Grace Whitmore." David turned to Grace with a polite but firm expression. "Ma'am." Grace's stomach sank. "This is your lawyer?" "No," Keisha said. "This is a lawyer who believed me when no one else did." David opened the briefcase and pulled out a slender binder. "We're moving forward, Mrs. Whitmore." "With what?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. "Formal action," David said. "Against you, against Whitmore Industries, for documented racial discrimination, personal interference, emotional distress, and obstruction of parental rights." Grace's breath left her body. "You can't be serious." David held up a hand. "Everything you thought was private? It isn't. Internal emails, security logs, staff testimony. An IT specialist has already confirmed the origin and authenticity of each document." Grace froze. "IT specialist?" Another figure approached, this time a man in his early 30s, nervous but determined. "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore." Grace blinked. "Tyler, Ryan's childhood friend, formerly a quiet IT employee, always loyal to her son." Tyler opened a separate folder. "I couldn't stay silent. Not after what happened to Ryan." Keisha didn't look triumphant, just tired. "He knew, about Emma." Grace's voice cracked. "What?" Tyler nodded. "A week before the accident, he got the report from the private investigator you hired. He found out Keisha was pregnant. He sent me this." He handed Grace a printed email. Ryan's voice echoed off the page. "Tyler, I need to see Keisha tomorrow. I don't care what my mother says. This is my child. I want to be a father." Grace felt the ground tilt beneath her. "He died driving to meet her," Tyler added quietly, "in the rain, because he didn't want to waste another hour." Grace swallowed the pain clawing up her throat. Before she could speak, a voice cut through the park. "Ms. Whitmore." A reporter approached, camera already recording. A second followed, then a third. Grace turned, stunned. What are they doing here? Keisha didn't blink. You think your company's actions are private? A Whitmore scandal involving discrimination and a hidden grandchild? The press doesn't wait for invitations. The reporter stepped closer. Ma'am, earlier this morning we received leaked documents showing Whitmore Industries used corporate resources to block a young black woman from contacting your son. Would you like to comment? Cameras raised. Phones pointed. People in the park slowed their steps to watch. Grace felt the world closing in. This is a misunderstanding, she said weakly. David stepped forward. No, Mrs. Whitmore. This is accountability. Emma ran back to her mother, wrapping her arms around Keisha's leg. Mommy, why are there so many people? Keisha lifted her daughter, kissing her forehead. Because, baby, sometimes the truth finally comes out. Grace's voice trembled. Keisha, please, not like this. Keisha met her eyes, steady, unwavering. You built this moment with every door you closed. Tyler added softly, Ryan deserved better. And the crowd recording them, strangers, parents, joggers, waited for Grace to answer questions she spent a lifetime avoiding. Grace Whitmore, once untouchable, now stood exposed, not by headlines, not by lawyers, but by the quiet, relentless truth of the woman she underestimated. And as flash after flash lit the cloudy morning, Grace finally understood. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of consequences. The headlines hit the city within hours. Whitmore Industries accused of racial discrimination and personal interference. Hidden grandchild, corporate power versus black mother's fight for justice. CEO Grace Whitmore under fire after leaked evidence. Grace watched the news from her living room, the muted TV flashing images of herself surrounded by reporters in the park. She had always been the one shaping narratives. Now she was a story, and not the kind that could be spun into sympathy. By noon, her board called an emergency meeting. Grace, the chairman began, voice tight. We have lost 3 contracts this morning alone. Investors are panicking. Grace sat stiffly. This will blow over. No. Another board member cut in. It won't. Not when we have copies of the leaked documents right here. They placed a folder on the table. Her folder, her decisions, her prejudice stamped into record. We're requesting your immediate resignation, the chairman said. Grace's breath caught. You can't. You built the situation, he snapped. We're trying to save what's left. Security escorted her out of the building she once ruled. Across town, Keisha stepped out of the courthouse holding Emma in one arm and legal paperwork in the other. David walked beside her, calm, steady. Reporters swarmed, but this time their tone was different. Respectful, supportive. Ms. Johnson, how does it feel to finally have justice? Keisha answered simply, it's not about revenge. It's about truth. She meant it, but truth had teeth, and it had finally bitten the right person. The settlement reached that afternoon was historic, one of the largest discrimination payouts in the state's history. Financial security wasn't what Keisha fought for, but it meant Emma would never struggle the way she had. As they left the courthouse steps, Tyler approached with a small box. This belonged to Ryan, he said. He kept it in his desk. Inside was a photo, Ryan smiling, arms around Keisha from years ago. A tiny note scribbled on the back read, someday, when I'm brave enough, I'll show her mom. Keisha's throat tightened. Thank you. Tyler nodded. He loved you both. He really did. Later, while Emma napped in the back seat, Keisha parked outside the community center. Children played in the yard. Mothers talked on benches. This was where she wanted Emma to grow, surrounded by people who saw worth, not status. Meanwhile, Grace sat alone in her silent mansion, scrolling through endless articles about her downfall. She tried calling Keisha once, just once, but Keisha didn't answer. For the first time in her life, Grace felt what it meant to have no control, no influence, and no audience to impress. Justice didn't roar. It whispered, and its whisper left Grace with truth louder than any scandal. Her actions had cost her everything she claimed to protect. 6 months later, the city felt different. Quieter, steadier, as if the storm had finally passed. The headlines had faded. The lawsuits were done, and Whitmore Industries operated under new leadership. But the people involved, the ones at the center of it all, were still living the echo of what happened. Keisha stood at the playground outside the new Ryan Whitmore Community Support Center, a place she helped build with part of the settlement. Children laughed on the swings, mothers gathered under the shade, and volunteers handed out after-school snacks. Emma ran freely through the grass, curls bouncing, cheeks flushed with joy. Keisha watched her daughter with a soft smile. This was what she fought for: not money, not revenge. Stability, dignity, a future where Emma would never question her worth because of the color of her skin. "Mommy, look," Emma called, holding up a drawing of a little girl standing between two hearts. Keisha crouched down. "It's beautiful, baby." "Teacher said it looks like me," Emma giggled. Keisha kissed her forehead. "It does. You're perfect." Across the street, an expensive car slowed to a stop. Grace stepped out carefully, clutching a small bouquet of daisies, the same flowers Keisha used to leave at Ryan's grave. Her posture was a little weaker, her confidence dimmed, but her eyes held something new: humility. She approached slowly. "Keisha, may I speak with you?" Keisha rose, steadying Emma against her leg. "As long as it's calm." Grace nodded. "It will be." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Children's laughter floated behind them, soft and warm. Grace extended the daisies. These were Ryan's favorite. I didn't know that until recently." Keisha accepted them silently. Grace inhaled shakily. "I lost everything, you know. The company, my position, my reputation." Keisha didn't gloat. Consequences aren't punishment. They're truth catching up. Grace nodded, eyes glistening. "You're right. And I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I'm here because I want to do better, even if it's far too late." She looked at Emma, who peeked shyly from behind Keisha's leg. "She's beautiful," Grace whispered. "Ryan would have loved her. He would have," Keisha agreed softly, "and she'll know he wanted her." Grace swallowed. "If you ever allow it, I'd like to contribute to her future, not to control it, just to support it." Quietly, Keisha studied her, really studied her, for the first time without anger clouding her view. "Maybe one day," Keisha said, "but not today. Today is for healing." Grace nodded, accepting the boundary with unexpected grace. "Then I'll come back another time, only when invited." She turned to leave, pausing once more. "Keisha, thank you for protecting the best parts of my son." Keisha watched her walk away, not with satisfaction, but with closure. Not all wounds heal cleanly, but some stop bleeding when the truth finally rises. Emma tugged at her hand. "Mommy, can we play now?" Keisha smiled. "Yes, baby, we can." As they walked back toward the playground, the sun dipped behind the community center named for the man they both loved, a reminder that pain can build purpose, and justice can create futures that prejudice once tried to erase. Share this if you believe stories like this shouldn't still be happening, and subscribe for more dark truths.